Diplomacy, as a standard component of statecraft, presents us as analysts with a bit of a puzzle. It is easy to grow up with a naive view of what diplomatic relations look like. Leaders coming together and trying to resolve some of the world's greatest problems, having their discussions at a big table and coming up with solutions that might not have been possible before. But then you start actually learning a little bit about international relations, and it's easy to become extremely skeptical. Leaders lie, diplomats lie, ambassadors lie. Everyone in international relations lies. And a lot of what diplomacy is between pairs of countries are discussions at tables in which you can just lie over and over and over again. Just think about all of the red lines that Russia has laid out on the table over the years, only for other countries to blow right past those red lines, and Russia doing absolutely nothing in response. Again, countries lie, leaders lie, diplomats lie, everyone in international relations lies. And yet, countries spend an inordinate amount of time engaging in diplomatic relations. And that is how we get a puzzle for us as analysts. If it were the case that diplomacy were completely worthless, as it is tempting to conclude, then countries would not even bother with that process. But again, they do. So, why? Well, today, we will explore this puzzle in 3 phases. The first section is on cheap talk communication. This is oftentimes the type of communication that diplomats engage in, and we're going to discuss why it is difficult to elicit truth-telling under these circumstances. And specifically, the components that you need for truth-telling to work are known as the incentive compatibility requirements. And we will see that in a broad variety of international relations contexts, the types of messages sent at the diplomatic bargaining table fall under cheap talk that is not going to abide by the incentive compatibility requirements that we need. Fortunately, though, we will already have some good news in this section. Some things that diplomats do break one of the 3 qualities of cheap talk communication. And when one of those qualities is broken, it is possible that the message that is being sent is actually meaningful. In other words, when one party hears what is being communicated, that party will actually update its beliefs about what the world looks like, and then change what it plans to do as a consequence of that new information. But then I will give you more good news. The next section will explore circumstances where cheap talk can also provide meaningful communication. These cases may not make up the majority of situations in international relations, but they still are important. Let me give you the short version of the 3 mechanisms that we will look at in this section. Starting off with similar preferences. When pairs of countries have similar preferences, in other words, they like each other and they agree with each other on what the world should look like, then it is oftentimes easy to get those parties to communicate successfully on particular issues. So you might think about this as the United States giving advice to Canada about what to do, or under perhaps more limited circumstances, but some circumstances still, Russia communicating information to China or vice versa. Note in this similar preferences category, we have one party communicating what to do to another party. That is going to be different from the second category, where one party might not be sure about how the other party feels about the world more broadly. For example, imagine that I don't know how you feel about a third country. I don't know whether you like the third country or you don't like the third country. I can ask you that question, hey, how do you feel about this third country? Because I am planning on attacking that third country. And you better tell me right now how you actually feel about it, because if you want me to attack the third country, I will. And if you don't want me to attack the third country because you're planning on defending the third country, I want to know that as well so I avoid the whole mess. Finally, although we have a nasty tendency of focusing exclusively on only a single dimension in dispute between pairs of countries, in practice, countries usually have multiple dimensions in dispute. And under those circumstances, one party might have private information about how it feels about one dimension versus another. It might care a lot about one dimension and not so much about the other dimension, or vice versa. And under those circumstances, it behooves the state in question to reveal the information to its opponent so that the opponent is making greater concessions on the thing that the first state actually wants to get. Finally, we will break free from the cheap talk paradigm with our third section, and we'll focus there on costly signaling, or what is sometimes referred to in the media as gunboat diplomacy. These are situations where you're actually spending money to communicate messages. So it's not just sitting at a bargaining table saying to the other side that you are doing something or that you're planning on doing something. It is you actually spending the money to go ahead and do that thing. And there are two ways that you can communicate information under these circumstances. One is to take actions that the opponent does not think is physically possible for you to do. If, for example, the opponent thinks that you're very weak, and you engage in some sort of military maneuver that only a stronger version of you is capable of doing, well, that forces the opponent to update its belief and realize that in fact you are not a weak type, you are actually a much stronger type. More subtly, this type of costly signaling can also reveal information about how much you care about the issues at stake. Your opponent might not be sure whether you're resolved or unresolved on those issues, and if you engage in costly signaling, say by spending a lot of money to mobilize soldiers to the particular area in dispute, that is a cost that only a resolved type may be willing to pay, and thus the opponent needs to update its information and realize that you must not be unresolved, because an unresolved type of you would be unwilling to engage in that type of activity, given how costly it is. And finally, we will discuss how that new information revealed through costly signaling affects bargaining dynamics. We will see that sometimes the crisis might be able to be resolved peacefully with that new information, but there is no guarantee. And so when we observe these sorts of costly signals taking place in practice, we're still going to have variation in whether the outcome is peace versus war. But let's start by defining cheap talk communication. Cheap talk is any message that has all three of the following properties. 1. There is no direct cost for telling the truth or telling a lie in the message. 2. The message is not directly verifiable. And 3. There is no change to the actions available based off of the message that you send. Now, you will notice that I said direct twice, and then even in the third component of cheap talk communication, there is still an implicit direct versus indirect distinction. What I mean here is that, as we will see later on, cheap talk communication can credibly convey information to the opposing side. So, as a prerequisite for that, there may be some implicit trust that I give you based on the circumstances that we're looking at, where what you are saying is something that I believe. And so even though I cannot directly infer the truth of your message purely based on what you are saying, I can make a strategic inference that you do not have an incentive to lie to me, and therefore I believe you. And because states or leaders may change their actions based on the information that they are hearing in the cheap talk message, payoffs may ultimately change for the players as well. It is just that there is no direct consequence associated with saying something that is true or saying something that is false. So if I say that I am very, very strong, and it turns out to be that I am very, very weak, I don't feel worse. I don't internalize a larger disutility as a consequence of having fibbed in the cheap talk communication. So again, for something to qualify as a cheap talk message, that message must meet all three of these components. If it fits all three, then it is cheap talk. If it's even missing one of them, it is not cheap talk. In a moment, we will discuss how cheap talk messages can be credible. But for now, what I want to do is explore circumstances where one of these three components is violated, and explain how we can see credible communication in diplomatic affairs work as a consequence of one of those things not holding. Let's stay true to the cheap part of the cheap talk moniker, and discuss the absence of cost in the message that is being sent. Anytime that you are actually paying a price associated with sending the message, you are no longer looking at a situation that qualifies as cheap talk. The most common way that you will see a break here is if you have a mobilization of military force into the region that you want to threaten. Actually moving supplies and people over to that particular location is going to cost you something. And because it costs you something, it is therefore no longer cheap talk. It is actually something known as costly signaling, which of course is going to be the third part of today's lecture. So I'm going to withhold further commentary on this subject matter until we get there. Another way that you could break the cheap part of cheap talk is if there is some sort of punishment given to a leader for having said something and then not followed through on it, or discuss some sort of resolve that the leader has and then not actually live up to that resolve. This is known as audience costs because ostensibly the audience of the leader is punishing the leader once more specifically for the inconsistency of the message. It's not just that the leader backed down in a time of crisis, it's that the leader said that the leader would stand firm and then despite that chose to back down later. It turns out that showing that audience costs exist in practice is very difficult. That is because when leaders back down, there tend to be associated punishments from the audience regardless of what the leader had said previously. There's a punishment specifically directed at the leader for backing down that is disconnected from what the leader had said before. And so if we're trying to associate a specific cost for the leader having said that the leader was going to do something, we can't just look at the cases where leaders have backed down, because there is going to be a punishment for the backing down part and the backing down part alone. There is also a theoretical issue here, where if the leader is choosing to make a threat because it is in the public's best interest for the leader to make that threat, it would not make sense for the leader afterward to be punished by the public. If the leader was doing the thing that the public wanted the leader to do in making that threat, and then perhaps backing down later because it was a bluff and it wasn't a good idea, if it's good for the leader to do that because the public also wants the leader to do that, why is the public going to punish the leader for the leader executing what the public would want to do? A lot of what is baked into audience costs is the notion that leaders should never bluff, and if they do bluff and are subsequently exposed, then their publics should punish those leaders. Well, it turns out that in international relations, bluffing is often a good idea, just like it is in poker. And if you have a leader who never bluffs, then you in the public are actually going to suffer some consequences, because there are some things the leader might have been able to extract by bluffing that you have denied the leader the ability to access, which is bad for you. So that's why audience costs have a lot of question marks around them. But to the extent that an audience cost does exist, that would not qualify as cheap talk messaging. You might also note here that a lot of diplomacy takes place behind closed doors. Given that, audience costs cannot apply. You have to have a mismatch between what is being said publicly and then what is being done afterward. And if these conversations are taking place behind closed doors, then the public never hears anything about it, so the public cannot apply any sort of inconsistency cost afterward. It's also the case with a lot of this diplomatic talk that's happening behind closed doors, or sometimes even publicly. You don't have costly signaling also happening alongside the messaging. So we are still left with trying to understand what diplomats can do in the absence of those costly signals, and also what might be happening behind closed doors. Okay, well, the second part of cheap talk communication is that the message cannot be directly verifiable. And here is a component of diplomacy that often breaks from this cheap talk framework. A lot of what gets said both in public and behind closed doors are messages that could be verified by the recipient of the message. You say something to me, and I do not have to take you at your word. You can tell me what's going on. You can tell my intelligence organization to check what is being said, and have my intelligence organization independently verify that what you are saying is true. And I learn something from this because I might not have known to look in the particular place that you are telling me, absent the message that you have sent. For example, perhaps you remember from our unit on war termination, the story of Robert Gates in the early 1990s. As a member of the Bush administration, Gates flew to India and Pakistan to tell each of those countries the results of a war game that the United States had simulated, if India and Pakistan were to fight a full-fledged war. The message that Gates was trying to convey was that war would be incredibly expensive to both sides, and therefore it would be in both India and Pakistan's best interest to negotiate a resolution instead. The trouble, of course, is that the United States had a bias. The United States just did not want the two of them to fight. It didn't matter what the negotiated terms looked like. The United States didn't care whether India got a lot of the deal or Pakistan got a lot of the deal. All the United States cared about was that India and Pakistan did not fight. In turn, it would seem that, of course, the United States would say, hey, war is extremely expensive, therefore you should not fight. And so the United States had a bit of a credibility issue here, or so it would seem. The thing is, though, it was not just the United States saying that a war would be very expensive. The United States was saying that we had simulated a war game that showed it was very expensive. And don't take our word for it, we actually have printouts here of what went on in the war game, what we assumed about how a war game would work, what happened with the interaction once the war game actually got started, and here is why there were so many casualties. So don't just take our word for it. Take this packet with you back home, show it to your military planners, show it to your intelligence agencies, and have them verify that what we are saying is correct. And indeed, India and Pakistan did just that. They took it back home, they agreed with the assessment that the United States made, and so a settlement was reached in part because of the information that the United States had conveyed. Not cheap talk, though, because it was verifiable. Another thing that routinely happens with diplomacy is essentially one side teaching the other side about how domestic politics works in the first side's country. For example, at least in the United States right now, the most important state to win electorally in presidential races is Pennsylvania. Generally speaking, if you win Pennsylvania, then you probably have enough votes elsewhere in other states to get a majority of the electoral votes, win the Electoral College, and therefore win the presidency. And so, in negotiations, one country might propose a trade policy that would not be very good for people living in Pennsylvania. And it might be up to the United States diplomats to point out, wait a minute, you may not be aware of this, but there are certain special interests inside of Pennsylvania that are going to be negatively affected by this policy. So if you propose this policy, I am going to be forced to reject because I cannot be in a situation where the voters in Pennsylvania are going to be mad at me. If we jump back to the George W. Bush administration, I have an anecdote that's like this, but on steroids. Bush wanted to protect the steel industry inside of Ohio and Pennsylvania. Ohio was much more of a swing state back then than it is now, and while Pennsylvania was definitely a left-leaning state, over time, as we now know today, it had shifted more to a swing state, and so it was very important to Bush back then, and it would only become more important to Republicans later. So Bush starts making moves to protect the U.S. steel industry by restricting imports from other countries. One particular region that gets upset by this is Europe. Europe, as you may know, as the European Union, actually originally started as the European Coal and Steel Community. There's a lot of steel in Europe that wants to export to the United States, and they were getting upset by Bush trying to step in and interfere with that process. Well, for those of you who are watching this, you may be very confused why I've had a picture of orange juice and oranges on the screen during this entire story. And the reason that I've been doing it is because oranges and orange juice were the solution to Europe's problem. Europe basically said to the United States, hey, if the United States is not going to be taking European steel, then Europe is going to stop taking US oranges and orange juice. That may seem like a very bizarre threat, but think about what the most important swing state was in the United States in the early 2000s. Florida, Florida, Florida. And what does Florida export a ton of? Oranges. So what was happening with this diplomatic communication was Europe saying to the United States, hey, you may not be aware of this, but we do have a tool in our toolbox that will really hurt you if you impose these restrictions on European steel. So I want you to take this information back home, internalize the threat that we definitely have and we will credibly implement, and think about what you want to do next. And of course, what happens next is that the United States quietly moves away from the steel protections. Here's another good story from the 2018 NATO summit in Brussels. It's become a bit of a meme at this point that the United States is constantly on the verge of withdrawing from NATO. And that is way overblown. The United States is not about to withdraw from NATO. But there was one single moment back in 2018 where this was a serious concern. And had things broken just a little bit differently, the United States might have walked out on that meeting and maybe effectively broken the alliance as a consequence. Trump's frustration with Europe's lack of defense spending had boiled over at this point, and Trump basically got up and demanded that everyone get up to the 2% of GDP standard that had been agreed to at the Wales Summit back in 2014 by the end of the year. And he was adamant that this happens, otherwise the United States might walk out. What stopped that from happening was a couple of things, both of which illustrate the idea of messages being sent in diplomacy actually resulting in the parties hearing what is being said and learning something that they were not internalizing before. The first half of it was European leaders telling Trump that they did not have the ability to unilaterally raise defense spending. They would have to go back to their parliaments and legislatures and advocate for that and sign laws that maybe over the course of a few months to a year plus get to an increase in defense spending to that 2% standard. Trump seemed to internalize that constraint to some degree, but was still concerned that what would ultimately happen is that Europe would punt it to the next year, and then when we arrived in the next year, Europe would punt it to the year after that, and the year after that, and so forth. The other half of this comes from Mark Rutte, who at the time was Prime Minister of the Netherlands, but would eventually become the next Secretary General of NATO. Rutte stands up and says to Trump, "Look, here's how you're going to sell this to the US public. You are going to say that Europe has collectively increased defense spending by $33 billion, and that $33 billion increase is attributable to Trump's leadership. Without Trump, we don't have that increase. And then, in the meantime, we collectively in Europe will work to raise it even higher." Trump seemed to like that, even taking notes on the bullet points that Rutte was saying and how to sell this to the broader American public. And indeed, Trump in later press conferences and speeches would adopt the same type of language that Rutte had used. Also, if you've ever wondered why Rutte became the next Secretary General of NATO, it's exactly because of this. He has a particular way of figuring out what Trump needs to hear to get Trump to back down from the various threats that Trump makes. Moving on, the last component of cheap talk communication is that the message sent should not result in a change in the actions that are available to those that are involved. And there are a couple of clear ways where that gets violated, which nevertheless sometimes get misconstrued in the media and broader online conversation into being what people think of as cheap talk. The first of these is political appointments. Roles that the leader has to fill that will then have a substantive impact on the government. Think about the role of Secretary of State, for example. The president has to appoint a Secretary of State, and then once the secretary is in office, the secretary has a lot of latitude to actually execute the policy of the United States. Moreover, if you think about the pool of people who could plausibly become the Secretary of State, each individual is going to have a slightly different expertise. For instance, if you appoint Marco Rubio, Rubio is probably going to do a better job focusing on Latin American politics because that has always been his own personal priority. In contrast, if you were more interested in improving relations with China or working more closely with some of your East Asian partners, it might make sense to appoint someone else instead. So, appointing a particular individual is going to constrain or open up different options depending upon what the expertise of that specific individual is. Another way that available actions may change, that often gets lumped into this sort of cheap talk diplomatic communication, but actually is not, is when a leader signs a particular law. That law may constrain the leader in the future, or it may open up new avenues that the leader can use to attack a particular country or engage in more coercive trade relations with a particular country. It is worth noting that this type of communication is much more effective for democracies because it is a lot more credible for democracies than it is for autocracies. When you have a single leader that controls everything in the country, having a law, with some air quotes around it, means very little. Having a law in an autocracy does not really constrain the autocrat, because if the autocrat doesn't want to abide by the law, the autocrat, at his whim, can get rid of the law and do whatever the leader wants. With those violations of cheap talk out of the way, let's get to the central problem with cheap talk messages actually communicating the correct information. And the issue here is known as the incentive compatibility constraints on communication. Let me walk you through the basics of this. As a starting point, we are interested in situations where one party has private information about the world that is relevant to the interaction at hand. To help conceptualize what I'm going to be talking through for the next few minutes, you might want to think back to the crisis bargaining unit. In that unit, we looked at situations where one side had private information about how effective a war would be from that party's perspective, or how costly that party viewed the war. Now, given that situation, or any other situation in which one party has private information, what incentive compatibility essentially asks is whether the party with that private information is willing to truthfully divulge what it knows. There are some subtleties in incentive compatibility, though, so let's work through this step by step. Step 1. Suppose that everyone tells the truth, which is again what we're trying to get at with incentive compatibility. So, in a crisis bargaining setting with uncertainty over resolve, an unresolved actor would say, "I am unresolved," and a resolved actor would say, "I am resolved." I am not trying to tell you that this would actually work out in practice, but if we want to understand why that type of communication would fail, we first need to assume that it would work and show that some sort of contradiction will eventually form here. Well, if everyone were telling the truth in the manner that we have assumed, then what would follow from that is that anyone hearing the words that are being said will be able to immediately identify what it is that the opponent previously had as private information. Again, going back to the crisis bargaining circumstance, if I hear that you are unresolved, then I am going to interpret that as you are actually unresolved. I am going to believe you and take you at your word. Likewise, if you tell me that you are resolved, I am going to believe you and take you at your word. The reason for that is if you assume that everyone is telling the truth, then when that message is communicated to you, the only way that you could have heard that particular message is if it came from that particular type. An unresolved type saying that it is unresolved, a resolved type saying that it is resolved. The key point of this second part is that after the receiver has heard the message, the receiver is going to adapt its behavior in response to what it has learned. We'll talk more about what that means for crisis bargaining in a moment, but I am going to hear that you are unresolved, and then I am going to strategize my bargaining proposals according to what I have just heard. Similarly, if I have heard that you are resolved, I am going to adjust my bargaining proposals under that circumstance, under the belief that you are resolved. And where things get tricky is that, retrospectively now, if I am someone that is unresolved, I could potentially lie and say that I'm resolved, allow you to interpret that as being the truth, and then have you bargain according to you thinking that I am resolved, only for me to adjust my strategy afterward. Likewise, it could go the other way around. A resolved type could lie and say that it is unresolved, have the recipient of that message strategize according to that belief, and then change what you are planning to do afterward. Because, guess what? You can. It's free to lie. And that takes us to the main question. We started off by assuming that everyone would want to tell the truth. Is that actually the case? Given that you will be believed and that you could manipulate the opponent accordingly, do you actually still want to tell the truth, or would you want to lie? Unfortunately, for a solid chunk of the types of interactions that we are interested in international relations, the answer is yes, and this type of cheap talk diplomacy won't work. What we're seeing now on the screen is an illustration of this dynamic at work, a crisis bargaining scenario where one party is uncertain over the other party's level of resolve. And to be even more precise, the white line that just popped up is the expected outcome of the war, and the distance between the white line and one of those red lines is the cost that Russia internalizes for fighting a war, given that it is either resolved or unresolved. You may indeed remember the problem here when we discussed this in the crisis bargaining unit as incentives to misrepresent. If the unresolved type says that it is unresolved, and the resolved type says that it is resolved, then after that message has been communicated, the proposer knows exactly what to offer to the messenger. If you tell me that you are resolved, then I will make a larger concession to you, because I know that if I try to make a very large demand, you are going to reject. You are resolved, you have low costs for war, and you would prefer to fight under those circumstances. Meanwhile, if you tell me that you are unresolved, then I know that I can extract more out of you because you have higher costs for war, and thus you are less likely to want to reject any given proposal that I make. In turn, there is no disincentive for the unresolved type to lie. If the unresolved type lies and says that it is resolved, in a world where cheap talk messages were to actually work, then the proposer would offer more generous concessions to the unresolved type. It has lied and it has gained accordingly. But that breaks the original assumption that the resolved type and the unresolved type were both going to honestly declare what their resolve levels are, which in turn means that the message that is communicated must be effectively ignored by the recipient. And this is not just a crisis bargaining issue. It's a bargaining issue more broadly. If you and I are negotiating on a trade deal, and I say that I am more inclined to reject your trade deal unless you give me more stuff, if that is the honest truth, then you would be inclined to give me more stuff, but then that means that you shouldn't be listening to me and taking me at my word in the first place. Now, from here, it might be tempting to conclude that cheap talk messages can convey no information in any circumstance whatsoever. But, as you will recall, the second section of today's lecture is to talk about the circumstances where, in fact, cheap talk can work. Hooray! The most straightforward case is when preferences between the messenger and the recipient of the message are relatively aligned. And we've talked about this before in the context of mediation. Imagine that I am an information provision mediator, meaning that I have intelligence about something in the world that makes me relatively confident that something is true that you do not have access to and you are unaware of. And I, as an information provision mediator, want to convince you about what I know. Well, good news, we have relatively similar preferences. I want to see you do well at the bargaining table if there is going to be a bargained resolution to this crisis, and in the event of a war, we will both internalize the costs of war at a relatively similar rate as compared to what we value the good at stake. Those factors combined imply that if we both had the exact same information in front of us, and you wanted to make a conservative offer, I would also want you to make a conservative offer. And if we all had the same information in front of us, and you wanted to make a risky offer, then I would also want you to make that risky offer. And that works vice versa, where if I would want you to make the safe offer, you would want to make the safe offer. And if I would want you to make the risky offer, then you would want to make the risky offer. All of that tells us that I can just communicate exactly what I know to you, and you can trust me that what I am saying is actually accurate. So alliances, for example, do not suffer the same type of crisis bargaining problem that we were exploring a moment ago. It is relatively easy for these alliance partners to communicate private information to them about what's going on with common enemies. That does not mean that every alliance partner is going to be able to communicate well with each other on every dimension. Specifically with NATO, for example, there might be some incentives to misrepresent how willing each party is to pay toward common defense. But what I am saying here is that it is a lot easier for France to communicate with Belgium than it is for France to communicate with Russia. So to wrap up this subcase, we are looking at situations where you and I agree on what the world should look like, and I know something about how to get to an end state that you do not know. That is in contrast to this next case, where I may know about your ends, ways, and means, but I don't know what you actually like about the world. It is possible that you and I are in agreement on some particular dimension about how the world should work, or you and I are in complete opposite poles on that dimension. You have private information about what your true preferences are, and I am unsure. Well, here, the incentives may be aligned in such a way that you would want to honestly communicate whether we are friends on this dimension or whether we are antagonists on this dimension. And I can illustrate this with a very nice example between the United States and the Soviet Union as it related to China's nuclear weapons program. For some background here, it is easy to forget that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China did not present a united front. Yes, they were both communist brothers, and during the early parts of the Cold War, they worked together. But then, going into the middling parts of the Cold War, there was the Sino-Soviet split, as there was a disagreement between them about what international communism should look like. Well, following that Sino-Soviet split, the United States had intelligence information that China was working toward building a nuclear weapon. Obviously, the United States did not like that. What the United States was unsure about, however, was the Soviet Union's opinion on the subject. Just how bad is this split? Would it be good for the Soviet Union if the United States stopped China from developing a nuclear weapon, or would Moscow frown on that sort of thing? Well, one way to find out is to simply ask, "Hey Moscow, do you want me to militarily intervene in China to stop China from developing a nuclear weapon? Because if you give me the thumbs up, I am going to do it, because that is something that I am interested in. But I also don't want to be in a position where the Soviet Union and China are working together to make my life a living hell. So if you do not want me to do this, because you would intervene either militarily or politically at the United Nations or elsewhere, you need to let me know now, because if you tell me not to do this because you don't want me to do this, I will not do it because it is not worth it to me to be involved in this sort of situation. And you can also be saved the expense of having to go through this process entirely as well by simply telling me not to do it." And that is what the United States did. The United States asked the Soviet Union, should we do this or not? And the Soviet Union's response was, yes, there is a Sino-Soviet split, but we do not feel that negatively toward our comrades in Beijing. We do not want you to do this, so you should not do it. And guess what? The United States listened. The United States did not militarily intervene in China to stop China from developing nuclear weapons, and China indeed successfully acquired a nuclear weapon thereafter. Interestingly, there are rumors of a role reversal later in the Cold War, where South Africa was developing nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union did not want that to happen, but the Soviet Union did not know how the United States felt about the situation. I say rumors here because this situation is not nearly as well documented as that bizarre relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union as it related to China. But if this is true, if this is something that did happen, and the United States, of course, said, no, we don't want you to do that, then this does fit into this class of communication and cheap talk messaging, where the incentives are aligned and truth can be told. Last up is communication on multiple dimensions. Obviously, we have seen before that when you are bargaining on only one dimension, the incentives to misrepresent are too strong, and cheap talk does not work. But that is not exactly how bargaining works in practice. It is very rare to encounter circumstances where there is literally only one thing being bargained over. And in fact, almost always with whatever negotiations you're having, there's also going to be some sort of conversation on a second dimension like money and financial aid, that sort of thing. In that type of crisis negotiation, an offer is not just where to draw the line. It is a combination of two things. It is a proposed line and a proposed amount of money transferred between the two parties. Similar to that early setup where one party may be uncertain over the other's resolve. One party here might not know how the other party feels about the relative value of the two dimensions. Do you care more about territory, or do you care more about money? I might not know that going into crisis bargaining. We can then run into a problem where my intelligence agencies might be saying that you probably are really interested in territory and don't care too much about the money. But if my intelligence agencies are wrong, then I'm going to make a proposal to you that is focused on the territory because I think that is what you actually want. But then you are going to reject that because you are not receiving all that much value because you don't care very much about the territory. What you really wanted was the money, and you weren't telling me that. Fortunately, there is a simple solution here. You can just tell me that. Go into crisis bargaining and say, hey, make that proposal more focused on money, and then I will internalize the fact that you're more interested in the money, and I will make sure that I give you an offer that's commensurate with the balance of power, giving you more on the dimension of the cash and less on the dimension of the territory. Notice that the key question here is, what do you want? Not how much do you want? When we're in the question of how much do you want, we're back in that realm of incentives to misrepresent. You can't say, I want a ton of cash and I want a ton of territory. What you can tell me is that I need to focus more on the cash and less on the territory. That is the type of thing that could be communicated. And indeed, once upon a time, an ambassador told me that this is the first thing that he always asks in a negotiation. What do you want? You can't tell me how much you want, but I need to know what you want so I can then base the rest of the negotiations around that. Moving on to our final section for today, we are going to abandon cheap talk and instead switch to costly signals. So now when you are taking an action, you are actually exerting effort, and the fact that you are exerting effort will allow you to credibly convey information that was impossible to do before. Let's start with the easy one. Imagine that I do not know whether you are a nuclear proficient country or not. That's going to determine how much I offer you in negotiations, because if you have a functioning nuclear weapons program, I'm going to be a little bit scared of you, and I'm going to propose a little bit more to make sure that we don't get involved in a nuclear crisis. But if you are nuclear incompetent, I am not going to offer as much. Do you see the easy solution here? You just test a nuclear weapon. You dig a really large hole in the ground, unlike the visual that you have here. We'll talk more about that when we get to nuclear weapons later on in this course. You dig a really large hole in the ground to contain the radiation. You explode it, it creates seismic activity, and then we all know that you blew up a nuclear weapon. And that tells me exactly what I need to know. I have to respect you more in crisis bargaining because you actually have the scary bomb. But that is not the only way costly signals can work. And indeed, you can communicate something a little bit more subtle about how resolved you are, simply by spending a lot of money on a particular issue area. Rewind to the beginning of today's lecture when I was talking about deployments to a particular crisis region. If you think that I don't really care much about this particular crisis, then you think I am unresolved, and as a result, you are going to offer me relatively little in those negotiations. One way I might try to convince you otherwise is by spending a lot of money to send a lot of military power over to your neighborhood. That is not a cheap talk message, because I actually had to spend money, and I'm not going to be able to recover that money in any way after the fact. I might be able to extract more out of you in the bargained resolution, but I am still going to have that deal minus the amount of money I had to spend by mobilizing the force to that area. Well, under some conditions, that cost of mobilization would deter an unresolved version of me from making that same sort of mobilization decision. Even if that mobilization level would fully convince you that I am resolved, in other words, the situation is incentive compatible given the cost of mobilization, the unresolved type would still be unwilling to engage in it. Yes, it will get more concessions at the bargaining table, but the unresolved type does not care much about the value of the good at stake. It does care, however, about the costs of mobilization. So even though it would get more at the bargaining table, it does not want to pay the price necessary to get that extra stuff via the bluff. As an example of what this can look like, in 2001, the Indian Parliament building was bombed by an entity from Pakistan. This obviously upset India greatly, and India wanted Pakistan to take steps to make sure that something like that not only could never happen again, but also to bring those in Pakistan to justice. Well, at the start of the confrontation, it did not seem that Pakistan thought India was really going to be able to make any serious movements on that front. Obviously, India was going to do something. The question is the extent of it. What convinced Pakistan of the gravity of the situation, though, is that India amassed a gigantic force of troops along the contact line between India and Pakistan. That kind of mobilization is very expensive. And again, it's the type of cost that's going to be paid by India, regardless of what ultimately happens in the negotiations. And as a result, that is the type of thing that can convince Pakistan that India is super duper serious about the situation. So with that new information, Pakistan realized it had to make more diplomatic overtures to India to resolve this crisis short of a war. And indeed, that is what happened. And eventually, India withdrew its troops from the region. Now, there is no guarantee that this type of signal will perfectly reveal information. If you have one type that is resolved and another type that is a little bit less resolved, then that little bit less resolved type is going to be tempted to mobilize at the level that the fully resolved type would want to, because it's not that much more costly for the slightly less resolved type to mobilize at that level, and that type is still going to be able to accrue the benefits of having greater concessions in crisis negotiations. Actually, going to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, you can see a lot of the variation in these mobilization outcomes. Everyone knows about the 2022 invasion, of course, and the mobilization that preceded it. What is less known is that there was also a substantial mobilization by Russia in the previous year. However, Ukraine and the rest of the West brushed it off as a Russian bluff, more or less, and indeed nothing serious came out of it, at least not then. Fast forward not too many months to February 2022, and Russia is mobilizing again, and this time Europe remains skeptical about the situation, but that was inaccurate. Russia was in fact serious about invading, and did indeed invade by the end of the month. And it is worth noting that the way wars occur under these circumstances is that the types of signals that a resolved and an unresolved type would want to send are not incentive compatible, meaning that the unresolved type is tempted to bluff resolve and go ahead and mobilize at the level commensurate with what the resolved type would want to do in a complete information environment. Then the opponent is unsure of what to make of the situation. It is seeing a large mobilization, yes, which would ordinarily be commensurate with a resolved type. However, it is possible that it is an unresolved type bluffing. And if the opponent has a belief heading into the situation that it is likely facing the unresolved type, then it is going to be very tempted to call what it perceives to be a bluff. That is how you get a war, because when the perceived bluff is called, and in fact the original state is fully resolved, then the fully resolved opponent fights a war. So, what to make of this lecture? Well, I think bringing up the cliché, don't listen to what leaders say, watch what they do, is fitting. That phrase predates me, but I have played a big role in popularizing the expression, and I think it does capture the vast majority of what we care about in international relations. The types of messages that we by and large hear in the media from leaders, as well as diplomats, is subject to bluffing. And unless you are looking at one of those specific circumstances that we were investigating earlier in this lecture, you are better off in some ways just ignoring whatever is going on there. Instead, it's more important to watch what leaders do, because the leaders, when they are doing things, are tending to pay the costs associated with the doing, and when there are costs being paid, there's inherent credibility there that the simple cheap talk messages lack. At the same time, though, you cannot look at everything that is done in international relations and conclude that there is inherent credibility just because a cost is paid. Yes, sometimes the costs are going to be large enough to effectively screen out the unresolved types, but that's not always the case. You really need to think about just how costly the actions are and how they connect back to the incentive compatibility constraints. Are they so costly that it would fully deter an unresolved type from taking the action, even if the unresolved type would be believed by taking that action, and it would be a completely convincing bluff? If that's not true, then the message that is conveyed is actually ambiguous. And of course, this warning goes both ways, because it is possible for cheap talk messages to convey real information under some circumstances. So I'm not trying to tell you that everything in international relations is ambiguous. You just have to be very careful about the environment that you're looking at and think through the logic accordingly. But what is not ambiguous is that this is a good time to conclude today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.